The alarms on the Aurelian crown tore through my skull before I was even fully awake. I rolled off my rest pallet and hit the floor running, my claws scraping against the metal grates of the corridor as red light pulsed from every panel. Something had entered our patrol zone, something that should not exist. My name is Vethrock Solon, and I am a tactical analyst for the Karathi Dominion, the oldest and most powerful coalition in this stretch of the galaxy. We have held the hollow expanse for over 600 cycles. No species crosses our border without permission. No ship arrives without our knowledge days in advance. That is what I believed when I sprinted onto the command deck that morning. I was wrong. The view screen showed a single contact, hanging silently in open space near the edge of our patrol lane. It had appeared without warning, without the gravitational ripple our sensors should have detected from a standard jump. One moment there was empty space. The next, there was a ship. Commander Yisa Thren stood at the center console, her 4 eyes locked on the readout, her tail flicking with the kind of irritation that comes from being woken for what she assumed was a glitch. "Solon," she said without turning, "tell me this is a sensor error." I checked the data twice before I answered. "It is not, Commander. The contact is real. Mass approximately 4,000 units. Hull configuration unrecognized. No transponder signal. No diplomatic beacon. No registered flag from any cataloged species. Then it is a smuggler," she said, "or pirates testing our borders again." I wanted to agree with her. It would have been easier, but something about the ship's shape bothered me immediately. It was not built for show. There were no elegant curves, no decorative plating, no obvious attempt to look impressive the way most warships in this region were designed. It looked almost plain, functional, cold. "Commander, the design does not match any database entry. Not the Velkari, not the Orsun Combine, not even the rumored fringe colonies near the outer rim." She finally turned to look at the screen herself, and for a moment her irritation faded into something closer to curiosity. "New species, then. How exciting. Send the scout vessel to make contact. Standard first encounter protocol. If they are hostile, we will know within the hour." I should have argued. Looking back now, I wish I had pushed harder, raised every concern building in my chest like a second heartbeat. But protocol was protocol, and I had no proof yet, only a feeling I could not justify with data. So I stayed silent, and the order was given. The scout vessel, a sleek diplomatic cruiser named the Haloing, broke formation and began its slow approach. I watched its progress on my console, my claws tapping against the edge of the console in a rhythm I could not control. The Haloing carried no weapons beyond standard defense measures. It was built for talking, not fighting. That was the entire point of a first contact vessel. You send something unarmed to show good intentions, and the other side responds in kind.
"Haley-wing approaching contact zone,"
the communications officer announced, transmitting standard greeting protocol in all known frequencies. Silence. "Repeat transmission," Commander Thren ordered. Silence again. I leaned closer to my console, scanning every frequency band we had access to, searching for any flicker of response. Nothing. The unknown ship simply sat there, unmoving, as the haloing closed the distance between them. I told myself this was normal. New species often took time to process unfamiliar signals. Some species did not use radio waves at all. There were 100 reasonable explanations. Then the haloing stopped transmitting. Not because it received no response. The transmission simply cut off mid-sentence, the communications officer's voice replaced by a wall of static that lasted 3 seconds before silence took over entirely. "Haloing, report your status," Commander Thren said, her voice sharper now. No answer. "Haloing, this is the Aurelian Crown. Report your status immediately." The bridge fell quiet, except for the low hum of the engines beneath us. I watched the tracking marker for the hailing on my screen, still showing its position, still showing it as active, still drifting at the same speed it had been moving at before the silence began. According to our sensors, the ship was intact. According to our sensors, nothing was wrong. But something was wrong. I could feel it in the way the air on the bridge had changed, the way every officer around me had gone still, the way even the engineering crew over the comm channel had stopped their casual chatter. "Solon, run a full diagnostic on our long-range sensors," Commander Thren said. "I want to know if this is equipment failure or something else." I ran the diagnostic twice. Both times, the results came back clean. Our sensors were functioning perfectly. The haloing was simply not responding, sitting silently in space, near a ship that had not moved, had not fired, had not done anything we could detect at all. "Send a probe," Thren ordered. "Non-intrusive scan only. I want eyes on that ship without risking further contact." The probe launched from our forward bay, a small unmanned drone designed for passive observation. It would take several minutes to reach a useful distance. During that wait, nobody spoke. I kept my eyes on my console, watching numbers that refused to make sense, watching a silence that stretched longer than any first contact silence should. When the probe finally reached visual range, the image that filled our main screen made my stomach tighten in a way I had never experienced before. The unknown ship was smaller than I expected, smaller than most of our own cruisers, yet something about its presence felt heavier than its size suggested. Dark hull plating absorbed most of the light around it, giving it an appearance closer to a shadow than a solid object. There were no visible weapon ports, no obvious engine glow, nothing that screamed danger in the way our threat assessment training had taught us to recognize. And next to it, completely intact, floated the haloing. "It is not damaged," I said quietly, almost to myself. "The hull is undamaged. No weapon scoring, no impact marks, nothing." "Then why is it not responding?" Thren said, frustration bleeding into her voice now. I zoomed the probe's camera closer, adjusting the focus until I could see through one of the haloing's viewports. What I saw there made the silence on the bridge even heavier than before. There was no movement inside, no crew walking the corridors visible through the windows, no lights flickering with activity. Nothing, except stillness. "Commander," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "I am detecting life signs aboard the haloing. All 12 crew members are present and biologically active. They are simply not moving." "Explain that," she snapped. "I cannot, Commander. There is no indication of injury, no toxin readings, no atmospheric failure. They are alive. They are simply not responding to any external stimulus, including our hailing signals." A junior officer near the back of the bridge made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper, before clamping a hand over her own mouth. I understood her fear because I felt it too, crawling up my spine like static electricity. 12 trained officers, frozen in place for no discernible reason, aboard a ship sitting quietly beside something that had not even bothered to attack them. "Pull the probe back," Thren ordered, slowly. "I do not want to provoke whatever that thing is." The probe began its retreat, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe we might simply withdraw, regroup, gather more information, before deciding our next move. That belief lasted exactly as long as it took the unknown ship to move for the first time. It did not lunge forward. It did not power up weapons systems that lit the void with aggressive energy signatures the way Karathi warships did when preparing to fight. It simply rotated, slowly, deliberately, until its forward section faced our retreating probe. "It's tracking the probe," I said, my claws now gripping the edge of my console hard enough to leave marks. "Pull it back faster," Thren ordered. The probe accelerated, but the unknown ship matched its movement with an ease that defied everything I understood about propulsion physics. There was no visible thrust, no engine flare, nothing, except smooth, silent motion that suggested whatever drove that ship operated on principles far beyond anything in our records. Then, just as quickly as it had turned, the ship stopped tracking the probe and returned to its original position, motionless once again beside the haloing. The probe reached our forward bay seconds later, undamaged, its cameras still transmitting steady footage of empty space. Whatever message that ship had intended to send, it had been delivered without a single shot fired, without a single word spoken. "Status of the hailing crew?" Thren asked, though her voice had lost the sharp authority it carried minutes earlier. "Unchanged, Commander. All 12 remain alive and unresponsive." She stood in silence for a long moment, staring at the main screen, at the small dark shape sitting motionless in the void, at the diplomatic vessel it had not destroyed, but had somehow rendered completely helpless without any visible action at all. "Solon," she finally said, "I want everything we have on unknown species capable of neural disruption at range. Cross-reference every fringe rumor, every discredited report, anything that might explain what we just witnessed." I began the search immediately. my fingers moving across the console faster than they ever had before, pulling files from archives that had not been accessed in decades. Most of what existed were myths, half-remembered stories passed between traders about a species from somewhere beyond the charted regions, a species mentioned only in whispers, in warnings nobody had taken seriously enough to investigate. A species called humanity. I found exactly 3 documented encounters in our entire historical record, each one vague, each one ending the same way. A ship would arrive without warning, a brief, often bloodless confrontation would follow, and the species responsible would vanish before anyone could gather meaningful intelligence, leaving behind only confusion and a healthy dose of dismissal from command structures who preferred convenient explanations over uncomfortable truths. "Commander," I said, my voice barely steady, "I believe we may have just made contact with a species referenced in 3 prior incidents across the last 2 centuries. The reports are incomplete, but the pattern matches. Sudden appearance, no advance warning, and an encounter that ends without combat, despite overwhelming tactical advantage on their part." Thren turned to face me fully now, her 4 eyes narrowing. "You are telling me a single, unarmed-looking vessel just disabled a fully crewed diplomatic ship without firing a single shot, and you believe this has happened before?" "Yes, Commander." "And in each of those prior incidents, what happened to the responding force?" I hesitated, scrolling through the final lines of the oldest report, a record so old it had nearly been purged during the last archive cleansing cycle. The words on the screen made my throat tighten before I could force myself to speak them aloud. "In each case, Commander, the responding force ceased to exist within hours of escalation." The bridge went silent again, but this silence felt different from before. This was not the silence of confusion or waiting. This was the silence of an entire crew slowly beginning to understand that we were no longer dealing with an unknown variable to be cautiously studied. We were dealing with something that had already proven, multiple times across multiple decades, exactly what it was capable of doing to anyone foolish enough to test it. And it was sitting less than 30,000 units away from our flagship, calm, patient, and utterly unconcerned by our presence. Commander Thren straightened her posture, the fear in her eyes replaced by something closer to grim determination. "Solon, contact Fleet Command. Tell them we have a confirmed contact matching historical reports of the species referred to as humanity. Tell them our diplomatic vessel has been neutralized without combat. Tell them we require immediate guidance on how to proceed." I opened the channel with shaking hands, knowing even as I transmitted the message that whatever guidance arrived would likely come too late to change what was already beginning to unfold around us. The unknown ship remained motionless on our screen, patient as a predator that had already won, and simply had not decided yet whether the rest of us were worth its time. Somewhere out there, 12 of our people sat frozen and breathing inside a ship that should have been theirs, waiting for an explanation none of us could yet provide. And somewhere far beyond our charted borders, I had the growing, sickening feeling that this single ship was nowhere close to being the worst thing humanity had to offer. Fleet Command answered within 20 minutes, which by their standards was almost frighteningly fast. I had expected hours of bureaucratic delay, the usual chain of approvals and counter-approvals that defined every major decision in the Karathi Dominion. Instead, a senior officer named Grand Marshal Osit Kuvra appeared on our main screen, his expression carrying the kind of confidence that comes from never having personally faced a threat he could not overpower. "Commander Thren," he said, his voice booming through the bridge speakers. "I have reviewed your report. A single unidentified vessel, unarmed appearance, no hostile action taken beyond disabling your scout ship's crew through unknown means. This does not warrant the panic in your transmission. Grand Marshal, with respect, the crew of the Haloing remains unresponsive. We have no method of retrieving them safely, and historical records suggest this species has a pattern of historical records based on unverified rumors and incomplete fragments," Kuvra interrupted. "I am aware of the so-called humanity reports. Every generation of analysts rediscovers them, and panics the same way. The Dominion has stood for 600 cycles. We did not achieve that by retreating from every shadow that crosses our border." I watched Commander Thren's jaw tighten, her tail curling against the base of her chair, in a way that told me she wanted to argue further, but knew the futility of doing so against someone of Kuvra's rank. "What are your orders, Grand Marshal?" she asked instead. I am dispatching the cruiser Ironclad Verity to your position. Captain Dross Malin commands her, and he has dealt with rogue smugglers and pirate fleets, twice the size of whatever sits outside your viewport. He will retrieve your scout crew, and, if necessary, remind this unknown vessel exactly whose territory it has wandered into. The transmission ended before Thren could respond, leaving the bridge in a silence heavier than any that had come before it. I looked at her, hoping to see some flicker of relief at the arrival of reinforcements, but instead, I saw only deepening concern, carved into the lines of her face. "Commander," I said carefully, "should we not wait for additional intelligence before allowing the Ironclad Verity to engage?" "Those were not suggestions, Solon. Those were orders from a Grand Marshal." She exhaled slowly, the closest thing to a sigh I had ever heard her make. "Prepare a full sensor sweep. I want every scrap of data we gather transmitted directly to Fleet Command in real time. If Captain Malin succeeds, wonderful. If he does not, I want proof of exactly what happened, so nobody can dismiss it as another rumor." I nodded and began configuring our long-range sensor array, my claws moving across the console with practiced precision, even as my mind raced through every possible outcome of what was about to unfold. The Ironclad Verity arrived within the hour, dropping out of FTL with the kind of confident, almost theatrical energy flare that Korathi warships were known for. It was nearly twice the size of the unknown vessel, bristling with weapon emplacements along its hull, its presence alone enough to have intimidated most pirate fleets into immediate surrender. The unknown human ship did not move. "Ironclad Verity, hailing the unidentified vessel," our communications officer announced, relaying the transmission across our shared channel. "This is Captain Dross Malin, of the Korathi Dominion. You are in violation of sovereign territory. Power down your systems, and prepare to be boarded for inspection." Silence. "I am detecting no response," the officer continued. "The vessel remains stationary. No power fluctuations, no defensive posturing." On the main screen, I watched the Ironclad Verity begin a slow approach, weapon ports glowing faintly as they charged in preparation. I found myself holding my breath, 4 lungs frozen mid-cycle, waiting for some reaction from the small dark ship that had already proven itself capable of disabling a crew without firing a single shot. "Captain Malone reports he is moving to retrieve the Hellowing crew," the officer said. "He is requesting permission to use minimal force against the unknown vessel if it interferes." Commander Thren's claws dug into the armrest of her chair. "Permission granted. Minimal force only. I want this resolved without unnecessary casualties on either side." The Ironclad Verity continued its approach, positioning itself between the human ship and the still motionless Hellowing. For a moment, nothing happened. I allowed myself a brief flicker of hope that perhaps this confrontation might end peacefully after all, that the silence from the unknown vessel indicated passivity rather than calculated patience. Then the human ship moved. It did not accelerate dramatically or flare with visible engine output the way our own vessels did. It simply repositioned, a smooth, almost lazy drift that placed it at an angle relative to the Ironclad Verity that our tactical models would have classified as a poor offensive position. Captain Malone's crew apparently agreed, because the cruiser's weapon systems immediately locked onto the new position, confident in their advantage. "Captain Malone reports the unknown vessel appears to be repositioning defensively," our officer relayed. "He is requesting permission to fire a warning shot to discourage further movement." "Granted," Thren said, though I noticed the hesitation in her voice this time, a crack in her earlier confidence that mirrored the growing unease tightening in my own chest. The Ironclad Verity fired. A single energy bolt, calibrated to strike near the human vessel without causing significant damage, the kind of warning shot meant to demonstrate capability rather than cause harm. I watched the trajectory on my screen, watched the bolt close the distance in less than 2 seconds, watched it approach the exact coordinates where the human ship had been sitting only a moment before. It struck empty space. "Confirm target status," Thren demanded, her voice sharp with sudden alarm. "Unknown vessel has relocated," the sensor officer said, her voice cracking slightly. "Current position approximately 4,000 units from previous coordinates. Movement registered in less than half a second." I stared at my own console, running the numbers twice, because the first calculation seemed impossible. 4,000 units of displacement in under half a second meant an acceleration profile that should have been physically impossible for any vessel of that mass, let alone one that had shown no visible engine flare during the maneuver. "That is not possible," I said quietly. "Apparently it is," Thren replied, her eyes locked on the screen. The ironclad Verity's weapon systems began tracking the new position, but before they could acquire a solid lock, the human vessel moved again, this time directly toward the cruiser, at a speed that made our sensors struggle to maintain an accurate reading. Captain Malin's crew, to their credit, reacted quickly, rotating their ship to bring a full broadside of weapons to bear. "Captain Malin is engaging with full offensive capability," the communications officer reported, panic beginning to creep into her professional tone. "All forward weapon batteries firing." The screen lit up with a barrage of energy bolts, dozens of shots converging on the human vessel's projected position in a pattern designed to overwhelm any defensive countermeasure through sheer volume. For a brief, hopeful moment, I believed we were witnessing the beginning of a swift and decisive victory. Then the human ship simply was not where the weapons converged. It had moved again, this time sliding beneath the ironclad Verity's hull, at a distance so close that our sensors briefly lost the ability to distinguish between the two vessels entirely. When the readings clarified seconds later, the human ship had positioned itself directly against the underside of the cruiser, close enough that conventional weapon systems could not target it without risking catastrophic damage to the ironclad Verity itself. "Captain Malun is requesting immediate tactical guidance," our officer said, her voice now openly trembling. "He states the unknown vessel has matched his ship's velocity and is maintaining contact with the hull. He cannot bring weapons to bear without risking self-damage." "Order him to break away," Thren commanded. "Full reverse thrust. Immediately." The order was relayed, and I watched the ironclad Verity attempt to pull away from the smaller vessel clinging to its underside. The cruiser's engines flared with visible effort, the massive ship straining against forces it should have easily overcome given its significant size and power advantage. It did not move. "Engines at maximum output," the sensor officer reported. "Ship is not gaining distance from the unknown vessel." I felt something cold settle into my chest as I watched the data scroll across my screen, numbers that defied every principle of physics our civilization had built its understanding of space travel upon. Whatever the human ship was doing, it was somehow anchoring the much larger cruiser in place, with no visible mechanism, no tractor beam signature, no energy discharge that our sensors could identify or explain. "Captain Malin reports unusual readings throughout the ship," our officer continued, relaying fragmented updates as they arrived. "Internal sensors detecting localized power drains across multiple decks. Engineering reports several systems going offline without explanation." "Order an immediate retreat," Thren said, her voice rising for the first time since the encounter began. "Full emergency withdrawal. All available power to engines." But even as the order was given, I could see on my screen that it was already too late for half measures. The ironclad Verity's power readings continued dropping in sections, decks going dark one after another, in a pattern too precise to be coincidental, as though something aboard that human vessel was systematically dismantling the cruiser's systems from the outside, without ever breaching the hull. "Captain Malin's transmission is breaking up," the communications officer said. "I am losing audio clarity." Through the static, I caught fragments of voices, panicked crew members calling out status reports that made less and less sense as the minutes passed. Then, abruptly, a different voice broke through the chaos, calm and measured in a way that immediately set it apart from everything else we had heard. "This is Captain Edward Hale, of the human vessel Ashcombe," the voice said, speaking in our own language with a fluency that should have been impossible for a species we had never formally encountered. "Your ship has ceased to pose a threat. Your crew remains alive and unharmed. I am returning control of your systems momentarily, and I would advise against further aggressive action." The bridge fell completely silent. I stared at my console, at the translated transcript scrolling beneath the audio feed, struggling to process what I had just heard. The human ship had not only disabled the ironclad Verity without firing a weapon, it had done so while monitoring our communications closely enough to address Captain Malin by name, and had spoken our language with a clarity that suggested either extensive prior study or technological capability we could not begin to comprehend. "Solon," Thren said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Confirm the translation is accurate." I ran the audio through our verification systems twice before answering. "Confirmed, Commander. The transmission was in our primary trade language, grammatically precise, with no detectable translation lag or processing delay." "That should not be possible," she said. "We have had no recorded contact with this species substantial enough to teach them our language at that level of fluency." I had no answer for her, because I shared the same disbelief settling heavily in my chest. Whatever explanation existed for how humanity had acquired such fluent command of our language, it suggested a level of preparation and intelligence gathering that none of us had anticipated from a species most of Fleet Command had dismissed as little more than rumor only hours earlier. Power slowly began returning to the ironclad Verity's systems, deck by deck, exactly as Captain Hale had promised. The human vessel detached from the cruiser's hull and drifted back to its original position, motionless once again, as though the entire encounter had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience, rather than a demonstration of overwhelming tactical superiority. "Captain Mallon reports all crew accounted for and uninjured," our communications officer said, relief evident in her voice, despite the lingering shock. "He states the ironclad Verity has sustained no physical damage. All weapon systems and engines have returned to full functionality." "And the haloing crew?" Thren asked. There was a pause before the officer responded, her eyes widening slightly as she reviewed an incoming data burst. "Commander, I am receiving updated telemetry from the hailing. All 12 crew members are reporting full responsiveness. They have regained consciousness and full motor function, with no apparent injury or lasting effect." I exhaled slowly, a small measure of relief washing through me despite the broader horror of what we had just witnessed. The crew was safe. The ironclad Verity remained intact. By any reasonable measure, this should have been considered a victory, or at least a survivable encounter. But as I looked at the data still streaming across my console, the power drain patterns, the impossible acceleration figures, the precise and deliberate manner in which the human vessel had demonstrated absolute control over the entire engagement, without causing a single fatality, I understood that what we had witnessed was not a battle. It was a demonstration. Humanity had not come to conquer or destroy. They had come to show us, with calm and devastating clarity, exactly how far beyond our capabilities they truly stood, and exactly how little effort it had taken them to prove it. "Solon," Commander Thren said quietly, her earlier confidence replaced entirely by something far more sobering. "Compile everything we have gathered, every sensor reading, every communication fragment, every detail of that engagement. Grand Marshal Kuvra needs to understand that this was not a rogue smuggler or an overconfident pirate captain." "What do I tell him it was, Commander?" She turned to look at the main screen one final time, watching the small dark shape of the human vessel, sitting silently in the void, patient and unbothered, as though it had all the time in existence, and absolutely nothing to fear from anything our dominion could throw against it. "Tell him," she said slowly, "that we have just been shown mercy, and that mercy is not something we should mistake for weakness." I began compiling the report immediately, my claws moving across the console with steady determination, despite the unease still coiled tightly in my chest. Somewhere out there, Captain Edward Hale and his crew continued their silent vigil, unconcerned by our presence, unbothered by our weapons, and utterly confident in a level of superiority that our entire civilization was only beginning to understand we had drastically underestimated. And as I finished the final lines of my report, transmitting it across every available channel to Fleet Command, I could not shake the growing certainty that this single ship, this single demonstration of restraint, was nowhere close to the full extent of what humanity was capable of unleashing, should restraint ever cease to be their chosen approach. Grand Marshal Kuvra did not respond to my report for nearly 6 hours, and during that silence, the Aurelian Crown remained at a cautious distance from the human vessel, monitoring it through passive sensors, while Commander Thren refused to authorize any further direct contact. The human ship, for its part, made no attempt to leave the area, nor did it make any further demonstrations of its capabilities. It simply waited, as still and patient as a stone dropped into deep water, while ripples of fear spread outward through every layer of our command structure. When Kuvra finally responded, his tone had changed considerably from our previous exchange. The booming confidence was still present, But beneath it, I could detect something new, a thin current of uncertainty that he was clearly trying to suppress. "Commander Thren, your report has been forwarded to the High Council," he said. "They have authorized the assembly of a full strike fleet under my direct command. We will not allow a single vessel, regardless of its capabilities, to humiliate the Dominion in our own territory." "Grand Marshal," Thren said carefully, "with respect, the data we gathered suggests this ship operates on principles far beyond conventional engagement. A larger fleet may not address the underlying problem." "A larger fleet addresses every problem, Commander. That has been true for 600 cycles, and I see no reason for it to change now because of one impressive piece of technology." His image flickered briefly as he turned to address someone off-screen. "I am assembling 42 vessels from 3 border systems. We will arrive at your position within 30 hours. Maintain observation distance and avoid further direct contact until our arrival." The transmission ended, and Thren turned to me with an expression I had rarely seen on her face before, a mixture of frustration and something that bordered dangerously close to fear. 42 vessels, she said quietly. Against one ship that disabled the ironclad Verity without firing a weapon. Perhaps numbers will succeed where individual strength failed, I offered, though even as I said it, the words felt hollow in my mouth. Perhaps, she said, though her tone suggested she believed otherwise. Over the following hours, I continued my analysis of the data we had gathered, searching for any pattern, any weakness, any piece of information that might give our coalition a meaningful advantage when the larger fleet arrived. The deeper I dug, the more disturbed I became. The human vessel's power signature, when compared against our records of the ironclad Verity's systems failing in sequence, suggested a method of system disruption that operated through some form of energy field, rather than direct physical or electronic interference. This was not technology we had any defense against, because it was technology we did not understand existed at all. I also reviewed, again and again, the brief transmission from Captain Edward Hale. His tone had been calm throughout, almost conversational, with none of the aggressive posturing or threatening rhetoric I would have expected from a hostile force demonstrating dominance. He had spoken as though disabling a fully crewed warship was a routine, almost tedious task, something he had performed countless times before and expected to perform again without much variation in outcome. That calm, more than anything else, frightened me most. As the 30-hour countdown continued, additional Karathi vessels began arriving at our position, each one larger and more heavily armed than the last. I watched from the Aurelian Crown's bridge as battle cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels assembled into a formation that stretched across a significant portion of the system, their combined weapon capacity theoretically sufficient to level a small moon within minutes. Yet through all of this, the human ship remained exactly where it had been since the beginning, motionless, silent, seemingly unconcerned by the growing force arrayed against it. "Solon," Commander Thren said, as I monitored the final ships joining formation, "I want your honest assessment, not what Fleet Command wants to hear. What do you actually believe will happen when this fleet engages?" I considered my answer carefully before speaking, knowing that whatever I said would carry weight in the reports that followed this engagement, regardless of its outcome. "Commander, based on the data we have gathered, I believe the human vessel possesses capabilities significantly beyond anything our fleet has encountered. Its ability to alter position instantaneously, its method of disabling systems without physical contact, and its apparent fluency with our language and tactics all suggest a level of technological and strategic sophistication that numerical superiority alone may not overcome. You believe we will lose. I believe," I said slowly, "that we do not yet understand what winning or losing would even look like against an opponent operating with capabilities this far beyond our own." She nodded, accepting my assessment without argument, though I could see the weight of it settling onto her shoulders, alongside everything else she carried, as the senior officer present, during what was rapidly becoming one of the most significant military engagements in recent Dominion history. Grand Marshal Kuvra's flagship, an enormous vessel called the Dominion's Fury, arrived precisely on schedule, leading the final wave of reinforcements into formation. Within an hour of his arrival, he summoned a tactical briefing across all command channels, his image appearing on every bridge throughout the assembled fleet simultaneously. "Officers of the Dominion," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding absolute attention. "What you see before you is the largest assembled strike force this border region has witnessed in over a century. 42 vessels, combined weapon capacity exceeding any reasonable threat assessment for a single enemy ship, regardless of its demonstrated capabilities." He paused, allowing the weight of those numbers to settle across the listening officers before continuing. "I understand that initial encounters with this vessel have been unsettling. I understand that some of you harbor concerns about facing an unknown technological threat. But let me remind every officer present of a fundamental truth that has guided the Dominion through 6 centuries of expansion and dominance. Numbers win wars. Strategy wins wars. Discipline wins wars. No single vessel, regardless of its capabilities, can withstand the combined assault of 42 coordinated warships operating under unified command." I listened to his speech with growing unease, not because I doubted his sincerity, but because I recognized the same overconfidence that had led Captain Maloon's crew into their humiliating encounter only a day earlier. Numbers had not mattered when the human vessel relocated faster than our weapons could track. Strategy had not mattered when it disabled an entire cruiser's systems without any conventional method of attack. I found myself wondering whether Kuvra had actually reviewed the detailed data we transmitted, or whether he had simply absorbed the summary and dismissed the more troubling specifics as exaggeration. "Our approach will be methodical," he continued, outlining a formation strategy that called for the fleet to surround the human vessel from multiple angles simultaneously, eliminating any single direction of escape, while overwhelming its sensors and weapon systems with coordinated fire from every side. On paper, the strategy was sound, the kind of textbook maneuver that had successfully neutralized larger threats throughout Dominion history. But the human vessel had already demonstrated an ability to relocate faster than our sensors could track, to disable systems through methods we could not identify, and to maintain perfect calm throughout an engagement that should have provoked at minimum some defensive panic. I had no confidence that a coordinated surround maneuver would account for capabilities that broke every assumption our tactical models were built upon. As the briefing concluded, and officers across the fleet began preparing their respective vessels for the coming engagement, I requested a private channel with Commander Thren, hoping to voice concerns I did not feel comfortable raising during the larger briefing. "Commander, I do not believe Grand Marshal Kuvra has fully internalized the threat we are facing," I said once the channel connected. "His strategy assumes the human vessel will behave according to conventional tactical principles, but everything we have observed suggests it operates entirely outside those principles." "I share your concerns, Solon," she admitted, "but I have no standing to override a Grand Marshal's tactical decisions, especially not based on speculation, however well reasoned." "Then what do we do?" She was quiet for a long moment before answering. "We follow orders. We gather every piece of data we can during the engagement, and we hope that our combined numbers provide enough variables that even an opponent with superior capabilities struggles to address all of them simultaneously." It was not a reassuring answer, but it was an honest one, and I respected her for not pretending otherwise. In the final hours before the planned engagement, I returned my attention to the historical reports I had uncovered during our initial investigation, hoping to find additional details that might prove useful. The records remained frustratingly vague, fragments collected from traders and fringe colonies who had witnessed brief encounters with human vessels decades apart, each report ending in the same pattern of confusion and unexplained losses on the part of whatever force had engaged them. One detail, buried in the oldest of the 3 reports, caught my attention in a way it had not during my initial review. The report mentioned, almost in passing, that the responding fleet in that encounter had numbered over 60 vessels, a force significantly larger than what Grand Marshal Kuvra had assembled, and that the human presence involved had apparently been a single ship as well. If that detail was accurate, it meant we were not the first coalition to attempt overwhelming humanity through sheer numerical superiority, and based on the report's grim conclusion describing the responding force's complete cessation of existence within hours, it meant that strategy had already failed once before, under even more favorable numerical conditions than we currently possessed. I brought this information to Commander Thren immediately, watching her expression darken further as I relayed the details. 60 vessels, she repeated, and they still lost. "The report does not specify the exact outcome in detail, Commander. only that the responding force ceased to exist within hours of escalation. It is possible the engagement involved factors we cannot account for given the limited information available. But it is also possible, she said, that we are about to repeat a mistake that has already proven catastrophic once before. I had no response to offer that would have provided meaningful comfort, because I shared her assessment completely. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us watching the tactical display showing our 42 vessels arranging themselves into Grand Marshal Couvra's carefully designed formation, preparing to surround a single ship that had already demonstrated capabilities none of us fully understood. Should we attempt to contact Couvra again? I asked. Present this additional historical context before the engagement begins. Thren considered the question for a long moment, before shaking her head slowly. He has already dismissed our previous concerns as exaggeration and panic. I do not believe additional historical fragments, however concerning, will change his approach at this stage. The fleet is assembled. The formation is set. He will proceed regardless of what we tell him now. Then what would you have me do, Commander? Document everything, she said. Every sensor reading, every tactical decision, every moment of this engagement, regardless of how it concludes. If we cannot prevent what is about to happen, we can at least ensure that whatever lessons exist within it are preserved for whoever comes after us, so that the next coalition to encounter this species does not repeat our mistakes through ignorance of what has already occurred. I nodded, understanding the weight of what she was asking, and turned my attention back to my console, preparing every recording system and sensor array at my disposal to capture the engagement that was about to unfold. The human vessel remained exactly where it had been throughout this entire buildup, motionless, silent, surrounded now by 42 warships arranging themselves into a formation designed to eliminate any possibility of escape. It did not seem concerned. As the final minutes ticked away before Grand Marshal Couvra's planned engagement window, I found myself studying the small dark shape on my screen with a growing sense of dread that had nothing to do with fear of physical harm and everything to do with the slow, dawning realization that we had spent the last day and a half preparing an elaborate, confident response to a threat we fundamentally did not understand. 42 vessels surrounded a single ship that had not moved, had not fired, had not done anything beyond demonstrate, calmly and without malice, exactly how far our capabilities fell short of theirs. And as Grand Marshal Couvra's voice crackled across the command channel, issuing the final order to begin the coordinated assault, I felt the same cold certainty settle over me that I had carried since the moment I first saw that ship appear on our sensors without warning. We were not the hunters in this engagement. We never had been. Grand Marshal Couvra's order to begin the engagement echoed across every bridge in the assembled fleet, and within seconds, all 42 vessels began their coordinated approach toward the human ship's position. I watched the formation tighten on my tactical display, a slow constricting circle designed to eliminate any avenue of escape, weapons charging in unison across every hull in a display of synchronized power that would have been intimidating against any conventional opponent. The human vessel did not move. All vessels confirm weapons charged and locked, the tactical officer announced across the command channel, awaiting final order to fire. Fire, Couvra said, his voice carrying absolute confidence. The void around the human ship erupted with light as dozens of weapon batteries unleashed simultaneous barrages, energy bolts converging from every angle in a pattern mathematically designed to leave no possible trajectory for escape. I held my breath, watching the screen, half expecting to witness the small, dark vessel simply cease to exist beneath the overwhelming weight of combined firepower. Instead, in the half-second before impact, the human ship vanished from its position entirely. Target lost, the sensor officer called out, panic creeping into her voice. Repositioning sensors, attempting to reacquire. The combined weapons fire converged on empty space, energy dissipating harmlessly into the void where the ship had been only moments before. I scanned my own console frantically, searching for any trace of the vessel's new position, my claws moving across the controls faster than I had ever operated them before. Contact reacquired, I called out. New position, designation grid 7, distance approximately 12,000 units from original coordinates. Before the fleet could adjust their formation to address the new position, the human ship moved again, this time directly through the gap that had opened in our formation during the initial repositioning confusion. It did not attack as it passed through, simply slipping between two of our destroyers with a precision that suggested complete awareness of every gap in our defensive coverage, every blind spot in our sensor coverage, every weakness in our coordinated approach. "It is inside the formation," Commander Thren said, her voice tight with disbelief. "How is it inside the formation?" I had no answer for her, because the data scrolling across my console made no logical sense according to anything I understood about propulsion or tactical positioning. The human vessel had somehow predicted the exact moment and location of weakness in our coordinated movement and exploited it with a precision that suggested either impossibly advanced predictive technology or a level of tactical understanding that made our entire fleet's careful planning look amateurish by comparison. "All vessels, adjust formation immediately," Kuvra ordered, his earlier confidence beginning to fracture audibly. "Close the gaps. Maintain weapon lock on the target." But maintaining weapon lock proved increasingly difficult as the human vessel continued moving through our formation with what I could only describe as casual efficiency, never remaining in one position long enough for our weapons to achieve a stable target solution, weaving between our vessels with movements that defied every acceleration limit our own ships operated under. Then, without warning, 3 of our destroyers along the formation's eastern flank began reporting simultaneous system failures. Destroyer Vance Hollow reports complete power loss across all decks, our communications officer relayed, her voice rising in pitch as additional reports flooded in. Destroyer Iron Thistle reports identical failure pattern. Destroyer Salt Reach confirms the same. I pulled up the affected vessel's positions on my tactical display and felt my chest tighten as I recognized the pattern immediately. All 3 ships had been positioned along the path the human vessel had taken during its movement through our formation. Disabled not through direct weapons fire, but through whatever method it had used against the ironclad Verity, some form of system disruption that operated without any visible energy discharge our sensors could detect or trace. "It is disabling them as it passes," I said aloud, more to myself than to anyone else on the bridge. "It does not need to engage each ship directly. Simple proximity appears sufficient to trigger the same effect." "Then keep it away from the rest of the fleet," Kuvra's voice snapped across the command channel, audible stress now cutting through his earlier composure. "All remaining vessels maintain maximum distance while continuing weapons fire." The remaining 39 vessels attempted to comply, spreading their formation wider, while continuing to fire whenever the human ship's position briefly stabilized, long enough for a targeting solution. The void filled with crisscrossing energy bolts, explosions of light that illuminated the darkness in brilliant flashes. Yet through all of it, the human vessel continued its movement unimpeded, weaving through the chaos with a fluidity that made our combined firepower look almost laughably ineffective. I noticed something else troubling as I monitored the engagement, a pattern in the human vessel's communications that our intercept systems had managed to capture despite the chaos of battle. The crew aboard the ship continued speaking throughout the engagement, their voices calm, almost conversational, discussing tactical adjustments with the same casual tone someone might use while completing a routine maintenance task. "Lieutenant Bryce, status on the Eastern Cluster," Captain Hale's voice said, clear and steady despite the surrounding chaos. "3 down, Captain," a female voice replied, equally calm. "Moving to the next grouping now." "Copy that." "Keep the pattern tight, no need to rush." I stared at the transcript scrolling across my screen, struggling to reconcile the casual professionalism in their voices with the devastating efficiency unfolding before us. They were not panicking. They were not even particularly engaged in the way our own crews were, frantically calling out positions and adjusting formations in increasingly desperate attempts to gain any advantage. The human crew sounded as though they were performing routine training exercises rather than facing down a fleet of 42 coordinated warships. "Commander," I said, turning to Thren with growing alarm, "their communications suggest this engagement is not testing their capabilities in any meaningful way. They are describing our fleet using the same tone someone might use to describe clearing debris from a corridor." She did not respond immediately, her attention locked on the tactical display, as another 2 of our vessels reported sudden system failures, their positions matching the human ship's continued path through our increasingly disorganized formation. "Solon, what is our current operational vessel count?" I checked the data quickly, my stomach tightening as I confirmed the numbers. 37 vessels remain operational, Commander. 5 have suffered complete system failure, though all crew reports indicate no casualties, consistent with the pattern observed during the ironclad Verity incident. At least it is not killing them, she murmured, though the relief in her voice felt hollow given everything else unfolding around us. The engagement continued for what felt like an eternity, but according to my chronometer, had lasted barely 15 minutes. The human vessel methodically working through our formation, with the same patient, unhurried precision it had displayed since the very beginning of this entire encounter. Ship after ship reported system failures as the vessel passed near them, each incident occurring without any visible weapons discharge, without any conventional method of attack our sensors could identify or counter. Grand Marshal Couvra's flagship, the Dominion's Fury, attempted a desperate maneuver, breaking formation entirely, to make a direct charge at the human vessel's position, weapons firing continuously, in an attempt to overwhelm whatever defensive capability allowed it to evade conventional targeting. For a moment, it seemed to work. The flagship's massive size and weapon capacity forced the human vessel into a tighter evasive pattern, its movements becoming slightly less fluid as it adjusted to avoid the concentrated assault from the larger ship. Then, abruptly, the Dominion's Fury's main reactor began registering critical fluctuations. Grand Marshal's flagship reporting reactor instability, our communications officer relayed, her voice cracking with growing panic. Engineering reports the same power drain pattern observed on the other affected vessels, but concentrated entirely on the primary reactor core. Order immediate reactor shutdown, Couvra's voice commanded, audible strain now completely overwhelming his earlier confidence. Switch to auxiliary power before we lose containment. The flagship's systems began an emergency shutdown sequence, weapons going dark, engines powering down, the massive vessel drifting to a halt as its crew scrambled to prevent a catastrophic reactor failure that could have destroyed not only their own ship but several others in close proximity. With the flagship neutralized and Couvra's command authority effectively severed from direct tactical control, the remaining vessels began falling into increasing disarray, their formation collapsing as individual captains made independent decisions about how to proceed without clear guidance from their commanding officer. I watched the chaos unfold across my tactical display, ship after ship, either disabled or pulling back in confused retreat. The careful, coordinated assault that Grand Marshal Couvra had been so confident in, completely dissolved within barely 20 minutes of actual engagement. Throughout all of it, the human vessel never once fired a conventional weapon. It never destroyed a single ship. It simply moved through our overwhelming numerical advantage, with calm, methodical precision, disabling vessel after vessel, through means we still could not fully explain or counter, treating our entire assembled fleet with the same casual efficiency one might apply to clearing an obstacle course, rather than engaging in actual combat against a determined military force. Solon, Commander Thren said quietly, her voice barely audible over the chaos still filling the command channel, as other captains called out status reports and requests for guidance. I want you to listen very carefully to their communications. Tell me if you notice anything else. I focused my attention back on the intercepted transmissions, filtering through the calm exchanges between Captain Hale and his crew, as they continued their methodical work through what remained of our formation. Lieutenant Bryce, how are we looking on remaining targets? Hale's voice asked. 8 more showing active weapon systems, Captain. The rest have either disengaged or gone dark already. Copy. No need to pursue the ones falling back. Let's wrap this up cleanly. Understood. This is actually a fairly standard patrol response pattern, Captain. Nothing here that required anything beyond baseline protocols. I felt something cold settle deep into my chest as those words registered fully. The casual confirmation that everything we had just witnessed, the disabling of dozens of our finest warships, the complete neutralization of a Grand Marshal's flagship, the methodical dismantling of our most carefully planned tactical response, had all been accomplished using nothing more than what this crew considered standard, baseline protocol. Commander, I said slowly, my voice barely steady, I believe what we have just witnessed represents nothing more than a routine engagement from their perspective. Their own description suggests this ship and crew operate well within normal capability parameters for what they consider standard patrol operations. Thren's expression, already pale with shock from everything we had observed, somehow grew even more troubled as the full weight of that realization settled over her. "If this is standard," she said quietly, "then what does their actual military capability look like when pushed beyond baseline protocols?" I had no answer to offer, because the question terrified me too deeply to even begin formulating a response. We had assembled 42 of our finest warships, led by a Grand Marshal with decades of successful military campaigns to his name, and we had been systematically neutralized by a single vessel operating, by their own admission, well within the boundaries of what they considered routine and unremarkable. As the remaining undamaged vessels in our fleet began their disorganized retreat, abandoning the engagement entirely rather than risk further losses, I watched the human ship return to its original position, near the still motionless haloing, calm and unhurried, exactly as it had been since the moment it first appeared on our sensors. It had not pursued our retreating vessels. It had not attempted to press whatever advantage it clearly possessed. It had simply completed what it apparently considered a routine task and returned to its previous position, waiting, patient, utterly unconcerned by the devastation it had just inflicted upon what we had believed to be an overwhelming numerical advantage. I began compiling the final data from the engagement, my claws trembling slightly as I processed numbers that confirmed everything I had feared and more. 42 vessels engaged, 12 completely disabled, including the Grand Marshal's own flagship. 0 fatalities across the entire engagement, a fact that should have provided some measure of relief, but instead only deepened the unsettling nature of what we had witnessed. This species had not come to destroy us. They had come to demonstrate, with overwhelming and almost effortless precision, exactly how vast the gap truly was between our capabilities and theirs, and they had done so using methods so restrained that not a single life had been lost, despite the complete and total tactical defeat of our finest assembled force. As I finished compiling the report that would need to be transmitted across the entire Dominion, warning every system, every border world, every allied species of what we had just encountered, I found myself returning to the same unsettling thought that had haunted me since this entire encounter began. If this single vessel, operating well within what its own crew described as routine baseline protocols, could accomplish this level of devastating tactical superiority against our most prepared defensive response, then the true extent of humanity's military capability remained almost entirely unknown to us. And somewhere out there, beyond the borders we had always considered secure, an entire civilization existed that apparently considered this level of overwhelming dominance to be nothing more than an ordinary day's work. The retreat back to friendly territory took nearly 2 full days, a journey made longer by the need to escort the 12 disabled vessels at reduced speed while their engineering crews worked to restore basic functionality. I spent most of that journey in the analysis bay aboard the Aurelian Crown, reviewing every fragment of data we had gathered, searching for patterns that might prove useful to whoever eventually had to formulate a coherent response to what our coalition had just experienced. Grand Marshal Couvra remained largely silent during the journey home, his earlier booming confidence replaced by a withdrawn quietness that several officers privately remarked seemed entirely out of character for a man who had spent decades commanding fleets with unwavering certainty. I caught only brief glimpses of him during shared command channel updates, his expression carrying the particular weight of someone forced to confront the complete collapse of every assumption that had previously guided his decisions. Commander Thren, by contrast, seemed to grow steadier as the journey continued, her earlier shock settling into a kind of grim, focused determination that I found myself admiring, even amid the broader unease still gripping our entire fleet. "Solon," she said, finding me in the analysis bay during what passed for a quiet evening shift, "I have been asked to prepare a formal statement for the High Council regarding our assessment of this encounter. I want your input before I finalize anything." I set aside the datapad I had been reviewing and gave her my full attention. "What specifically would you like my assessment to address, Commander?" "Everything," she said. "What we witnessed, what we believe it means, and most importantly, what we believe our coalition should do moving forward, given what we now understand about this species." I considered the question carefully, drawing together threads of analysis I had been compiling throughout the entire ordeal, threads that painted a picture far more complex and unsettling than a simple military threat assessment could adequately capture. "Commander, I believe the most critical element of our assessment must address the nature of restraint demonstrated throughout this entire encounter. We engaged this species with hostile intent on two separate occasions, first through Captain Maloon's aggressive approach, and second, through Grand Marshal Couvra's full fleet assault. In both instances, the human vessel possessed clear capability to inflict catastrophic casualties, yet chose not to do so. You believe this restraint indicates peaceful intent? I believe it indicates something more complicated than simple peaceful intent, Commander. A species that values diplomacy would likely have attempted clearer communication before allowing two separate hostile engagements to escalate as far as they did. Instead, what we witnessed suggests a civilization supremely confident in its own capabilities, one that does not feel threatened enough by our aggression to respond with proportional force, because doing so would require no meaningful effort on their part, regardless of the outcome. Thren absorbed this for a long moment, her tail flicking thoughtfully against the floor of the analysis bay. That is a deeply unsettling assessment, Solon. It is the most accurate one I can offer based on available data, Commander. She nodded slowly, beginning to make notes on her own datapad, as she processed everything I had relayed. What of the historical reports you uncovered? The prior encounters from decades past? I have reviewed them extensively during our return journey, I said. What troubles me most is the consistency across all documented cases. Regardless of the responding force's size, regardless of the tactics employed, the outcome remains remarkably similar. Demonstrated restraint, despite overwhelming tactical advantage, followed by the eventual withdrawal of the human vessel without any apparent territorial or resource-related motivation behind the encounter. You believe these encounters serve some other purpose? I believe, I said carefully, choosing my words with deliberate precision, given the weight they would carry once included in our formal report, that we may be witnessing a pattern of deliberate evaluation. Each encounter appears designed to test capability without inflicting lasting harm, almost as though humanity is gathering information about coalitions and species they encounter, rather than pursuing any immediate hostile agenda. The implications of that statement hung heavily in the air between us, and I watched Commander Thren's expression shift through several stages of processing before settling into something resembling cautious acceptance of an uncomfortable possibility. If that assessment is accurate, she said slowly, then this single vessel represents not an isolated threat, but a probe, a scout sent ahead of something larger, gathering intelligence about our capabilities, our response patterns, our willingness to escalate when confronted with the unknown. That is my professional assessment, Commander. Though I want to be clear that it remains speculation, based on limited data. We have no direct confirmation of humanity's broader intentions or the scale of their actual military capability, beyond what this single vessel has demonstrated. And what this single vessel has demonstrated, Thren said quietly, was enough to disable a 42-ship fleet, including a Grand Marshal's flagship, without a single fatality. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us absorbing the full weight of that statement, before she finally spoke again. I will include your assessment in my report, Solon, though I suspect the High Council may find it as difficult to accept as Grand Marshal Couvra initially found our earlier warnings about this species' capabilities. Perhaps, I said, but after witnessing the outcome of dismissing those earlier warnings, I would hope the Council demonstrates greater willingness to take this assessment seriously. She offered a tired, humorless smile in response. Hope is a fine sentiment, Solon, but I have learned through long experience that institutional pride rarely yields easily to uncomfortable truths, regardless of how thoroughly those truths have been demonstrated. Our fleet arrived back at the primary Korathi shipyards 3 days later, the damaged vessels immediately taken into repair docks while the remaining undamaged ships dispersed for debriefing across various command facilities. I found myself summoned, alongside Commander Thren, to a formal hearing before a panel of senior officials tasked with reviewing the entire encounter and formulating an official coalition response. The hearing lasted nearly 6 hours, during which I presented every piece of data we had gathered, every analysis I had compiled, every uncomfortable conclusion my research had led me toward. The panel listened with the kind of careful, measured attention that suggested they understood the gravity of what they were hearing, even if their expressions occasionally betrayed the same difficulty accepting these conclusions that Grand Marshal Couvra had displayed before his own costly demonstration of humanity's capabilities. When the hearing concluded, the senior official presiding over the panel, an elderly Korathi named Director Vethis Alquin, addressed the room with a gravity that matched the seriousness of everything we had presented. This assessment will be transmitted to every allied species across our coalition network immediately, she said. Whatever disagreements exist regarding the deeper implications of this encounter, the tactical data alone demonstrates a threat level that cannot be safely ignored or dismissed through institutional pride. We will be establishing a dedicated task force to study every available record of human encounters, and I want both Commander Thren and Analyst Solon to lead that effort, given your direct experience with this situation. I accepted the assignment with a mixture of relief and continued unease, grateful that our warnings had finally been taken seriously, yet deeply troubled by everything that acceptance implied about the genuine threat now confirmed to exist along our borders. In the weeks that followed, I dedicated myself entirely to the task force's research, poring over every fragment of historical data, every rumor and unverified report, every scrap of information that might help us understand humanity's true capabilities and intentions. The picture that slowly emerged remained frustratingly incomplete, but certain patterns continued to reinforce themselves with each new piece of evidence we uncovered. Every documented encounter, regardless of the responding force's size or composition, ended in remarkably similar fashion, demonstrated restraint despite clear capability for greater harm, a withdrawal that suggested satisfaction with whatever information had been gathered, rather than any territorial ambition, and perhaps most troubling of all, a consistent pattern suggesting that the vessels involved in these encounters represented not specialized military assets, but standard, almost mundane components of a much larger and largely unknown human military structure. I found myself returning often to that final intercepted communication from the battle, the casual confirmation from Lieutenant Bryce that our entire 42-ship engagement had represented nothing more than a standard patrol response pattern, requiring nothing beyond baseline protocols to resolve successfully. That single statement continued to echo through my analysis, a constant reminder that whatever we had witnessed represented only the smallest possible glimpse into a civilization's true capabilities. During one of our task force meetings, Commander Thren raised a question that had been quietly forming in my own mind throughout these weeks of research. Solon, if this encounter represented merely a standard patrol vessel operating within baseline protocols, what does that suggest about the actual scale of humanity's broader military presence? I had considered this question extensively, and the answer I had arrived at provided little comfort despite weeks of careful analysis. I believe, Commander, that we have encountered only the smallest visible fragment of a much larger and significantly more capable force. If a single standard patrol vessel can accomplish what we witnessed, the true scale of their dedicated military capability, should circumstances ever require its deployment, likely exceeds anything our current threat models are prepared to address. Then what do you recommend our coalition do moving forward? I thought carefully before answering, drawing together everything I had learned throughout this entire ordeal into a final, considered recommendation. I believe our priority must shift away from any consideration of confrontation entirely, Commander. Every encounter we have on record demonstrates that aggression, regardless of scale, fails to provoke proportional retaliation, suggesting humanity does not perceive coalitions like ours as genuine threats worth taking seriously through conventional military response. Our best path forward likely involves cautious, measured attempts at peaceful communication, demonstrating clearly that we pose no threat and have no interest in further hostile engagement. You believe diplomacy is possible with a species this far beyond our capabilities? I believe, I said slowly, that the alternative, continuing to provoke a civilization capable of dismantling our finest fleets through what they consider routine, baseline operations, represents a far greater risk than attempting to establish peaceful relations, however uncertain that path might prove. Thren nodded thoughtfully, making note of my recommendation for inclusion in our ongoing report to the High Council. As our meeting concluded and I gathered my materials to return to my quarters for the evening, I found myself pausing at the viewport along the corridor outside our research facility, staring out at the stars beyond our shipyard, somewhere among which a single human vessel had once sat motionless and patient, demonstrating with calm, devastating clarity exactly how thoroughly our coalition had misjudged its place within this galaxy. We had spent 600 cycles believing ourselves among the dominant powers of this region, secure in our technological achievements and military strength. A single ship, operating well within what its crew considered ordinary baseline protocols, had unraveled that confidence within the span of a few short days, leaving behind not destruction or conquest, but something perhaps more unsettling in its implications. A clear, undeniable demonstration that an entire civilization existed beyond our previous understanding, one whose true capabilities remained almost entirely unknown to us, whose intentions toward our coalition and countless others across this galaxy could not yet be confidently predicted, and whose standard, unremarkable patrol vessels were apparently sufficient to neutralize our most carefully prepared defensive responses, without a single life lost in the process. As I made my way back toward my quarters that evening, I found myself wondering, not for the first time since this entire encounter began, what exactly humanity's full military presence might look like, should circumstances ever require them to abandon the restraint they had shown so consistently throughout every documented encounter across the decades. I hoped, sincerely and perhaps somewhat naively, that we would never need to discover the answer to that question. But somewhere deep in my analytical mind, the part of me trained to identify patterns and project likely outcomes based on available evidence, I understood that hope alone had never been sufficient protection against the unknown. And whatever humanity truly represented, whatever vast and largely unrevealed capability existed behind that single, patient, unremarkable warship, the galaxy itself had just received its first quiet, undeniable warning that the established order we had taken for granted, across 6 centuries of confident dominance, was no longer something we could assume would remain unchallenged. Somewhere out there, beyond our charted borders, humanity continued its patient watch. And we, along with every other coalition and species sharing this galaxy, were only beginning to understand exactly how much that watch should concern us all.